Hello, today we're going to review Knowledge 9, Lesson 1, Fairy Tales. Throughout the lesson, you will see these learning targets. I can discuss elements of stories. I can identify characters, settings, and events in a fairy tale. I can understand the word wisdom. I can understand the phrase, the land of Nod. I can write using the conjunction because to explain why Sleeping Beauty is a fairy tale. In previous domains, we have heard fiction and nonfiction read-alouds. What is the difference between fiction and nonfiction? Fiction is not true and nonfiction is true. It's factual information. Remember, all the tales that we have heard this year were fiction. They all have characters, a setting, plot, and sometimes a moral or a lesson. In this domain, we're going to learn more about a special kind of fiction called a fairy tale. Let's look at our Elements of Fairy Tales chart. The setting of the story is the place and time in which the story takes place. We'll write the setting right there. In fairy tales, the characters or people and animals who are featured in the story can be both real and magical. We'll record our characters right here. In fairy tales, there are some things that could happen in your life, but many of the things that happen in these stories are fantasy or a kind of make-believe that can't really happen. All tales have a plot. But fairy tales often have imaginary or magical events, also known as elements of fantasy, things that couldn't happen in real life. This is where we'll record the events. In fairy tales, the characters often face some sort of problem, which is solved by the end of the story. This is how we write the problem and solution. Fairy tales always end happily. This is where we will record the ending. We have our fairy tale this year, Cinderella. Let's take a look at the Elements of Fairy Tales chart with information about Cinderella filled in. The setting of Cinderella is Cinderella's house and a palace. It happened once upon a time. In Cinderella, there were real characters and magical characters. Some of the real characters were Cinderella, her stepmother, her stepsisters, and the prince. A magical character from Cinderella was the fairy godmother. A fantasy event that happened in Cinderella, a fairy godmother appears and uses magic to make Cinderella's wish come true, turning a pumpkin into a coach, mice into horses, and a rat into a coachman. A problem in Cinderella was that she was not allowed to go to the ball. The solution to that problem was her fairy godmother used magic to make it possible for her to attend the ball. In the end, they lived happily ever after. Many of the fairy tales that we will hear were collected long ago by two brothers named Jacob and Willem Grimm. They are often called the Brothers Grimm. The brothers lived in a place now called Germany. Many of the stories that we know now as fairy tales had been told orally for many years in their country and in other countries too. The brothers decided to write the stories down and make a book out of them. In today's fairy tale, and in another fairy tale you will hear later, you will hear about spinning wheels. Spinning wheels are tools used to spin thread and yarn. The stick-like tool on the spinning wheel where the thread and yarn goes after it is spun is called a spindle. People use parts of certain plants such as cotton and flax, wool from animals like sheep and alpacas, and even hair from certain goats and rabbits to make thread and yarn. Most thread and yarn is made by machines in factories today. But some people still use spinning wheels to make their own thread or yarn. Before we begin our story, let's review some key vocabulary terms. Enchanted. If someone is enchanted, they are under a magic spell. Prick. To prick something means to pierce it or to make a small hole or cut with something pointed or sharp. A spell is believed to make magic happen. Virtue is goodness. Wisdom is judgment, understanding what is right and wrong. Our purpose for listening. Today, as I read the story, listen carefully to the fairy tale so you can find out about a problem caused by a spinning wheel.
Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who for many years were very sad because they had no child. At last a little daughter was born to them, and the king was so happy that he planned a great feast in the palace, to which he would invite all of his friends and relatives. A feast is a big fancy meal. People sometimes have feasts at a party or celebration when something special happens. What do you think is on the list the king is carrying in this image? Now, in his country there were 13 fairies. Of course, the king wished to invite all of the fairies to the feast too, so that each might look kindly upon his child, and perhaps give the baby a special fairy gift. But as the king had only 12 gold plates for the fairies to eat from, it was decided that one fairy had to be left out. How do you think the 13th fairy will feel about not being invited to the feast? Let's count the number of fairies we see at the feast. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The feast was held, and what a wonderful celebration it was. As it drew to an end, the fairies came forward to give the child their special gifts. One said to the child, "I give you the gift of virtue, so that you may be good." Another said, "I give you the gift of wisdom, so that you may be wise." Virtue is another word for goodness, and wisdom is the ability to know what is right and to make good choices. A third fairy gave the child the gift of beauty. A fourth gave her riches, and on it went, with each fairy giving everything in the world that one could wish for. 11 of the fairies had given their gifts, and the 12th was just about to speak when suddenly in came the 13th fairy, the one who had been left out. She was very angry, and she cried out in a loud voice, "When the princess is 15 years of age, she shall prick herself with a spindle and die." Prick means to make a small hole or cut with something pointed or sharp, like the spindle on a spinning wheel. Without another word, every fairy left the hall. Everyone was terrified at what she had said. Then the 12th fairy came forward and said, "I cannot undo the evil spell, but I can soften it. Here, then, is my gift to the child. The princess shall not die, but she will fall into a deep sleep for 100 years." So how did the 12th fairy soften the spell? The king was determined to protect his child. "Surely," he said, "my daughter cannot prick herself with the spindle if she never sees one." So he gave an order that every spindle in the kingdom should be burned. Why does the king want all of the spindles in the kingdom burned? The princess grew up, and all the fairies' gifts to the child were plain to see. She was good, wise, kind, and beautiful. Everyone who saw her loved her. On the day that she turned 15, the king and queen were away from the palace. The princess was left on her own, and she wandered about the palace, looking into all sorts of places and peeking into rooms that she had never explored before. She climbed a narrow, winding stair that led to a little door with a rusty key sticking out of the lock. She turned the key, and the door opened, and there, in a little room, sat an old woman with a spinning wheel, busily spinning away. What do you think is going to happen? "Good day," said the princess, entering the room. "What are you doing?" she asked, for she had never seen a spinning wheel before. "I am spinning," said the old woman. The princess stretched forth her hand and asked, "What is this thing that spins around so merrily?" But hardly had she spoken when she pricked her finger on the spinning wheel spindle, and in that very moment she fell into a deep sleep. Why has the princess fallen asleep? Time sleep fell upon everyone in the palace. There is a milkmaid. Do you remember from the fables and stories what a milkmaid does? Good. The king and queen, who had fast asleep, who had just come home and were in the great hall, fell fast asleep. The horses in their stalls, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons on the roof, and the flies on the wall, all fell asleep. Even the fire on the hearth went out. The wind stopped, and not a leaf fell from the trees. A earth is the bottom of a fireplace where the wood is put. In time a hedge of thorns began to grow around the castle, which grew thicker and higher every year, until at last nothing could be seen of the castle, not even the flags on the highest towers. As the years passed, stories spread throughout the land of a beautiful princess sleeping behind a wall of thorns. Many a young prince came, but none could break through the thorns. But at long last, after many, many years, there came into the country a king's son, who heard an old man tell that there was a castle standing behind the hedge of thorns, and that there a beautiful enchanted princess lay sleeping. When something is enchanted, it is under a magic spell. When is the princess's enchantment supposed to end? The prince said, "I shall make my way through and see the lovely princess." The old man warned him that many had tried and failed, but the prince would not listen. Now the 100 years were at an end, and the day had come for the sleeping princess to be awakened. When the prince drew near the hedge of thorns, it changed into a hedge of beautiful flowers, which bent aside to let him pass. When he reached the castle yard, he saw the horses and dogs lying asleep, and on the roof the pigeons were sitting, with their heads under their wings. As he entered the castle and climbed the steps, the prince saw everyone still asleep, the king, the queen, the cook, the maids, everyone. All was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing. At last the prince went up the narrow winding stair and came to the room where the princess was sleeping. When he saw her looking so lovely in her sleep, he could not turn his eyes away. He bent down and kissed her, and she opened her eyes and smiled at him. Together they went down the stairs, and they saw the king and queen waking up, and all the people in the castle waking up and looking at each other in great surprise. The horses in the yard got up and shook themselves. The dogs sprang up and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof flew into the fields. The flies on the wall buzzed and crept a little farther. Even the kitchen fire leapt up and blazed. At last the wedding of the prince and princess was held with great feasting and rejoicing, and they lived happily together for the rest of their days. Rejoicing is a time of happiness and celebration.
Now, let's answer some comprehension questions. At the beginning of the fairy tale, why do the king and queen have a feast? The king and queen had a feast to celebrate the birth of their daughter. Who is invited to the feast? Friends, family, and 12 of the 13 fairies were invited. What are some of the gifts given to the child by the fairies? The child is given the gifts of virtue, wisdom, beauty, and riches. What does it mean to give the gift of virtue? The gift of virtue is the gift of being good. Do you think the king makes a good decision not to invite the 13th fairy? Tell someone near you what you think. Why is the 13th fairy angry? The fairy is angry because she was not invited to the feast. What does she do? She casts a spell on the princess, saying that she will die on her 15th birthday when she pricks her finger on a spindle. How does the 12th fairy, who had not yet given her gift, solve the problem of the evil spell? The 12th fairy changes the spell so that the princess will fall into a deep sleep for 100 years instead of dying. How does the king solve the problem of the evil spell? The king orders that all spindles in the kingdom should be burned. What happens on the princess's 15th birthday when she finds a spindle? The princess pricks her finger on the spindle and falls asleep. How does this fairy tale end? The prince kisses the enchanted princess on the day the evil spell ends, and the princess wakes up. What elements of this fairy tale could not happen in real life? Tell someone near you what you think. In the reading you heard, another fairy said, I give you the gift of wisdom so that you may be wise. Say the word wisdom with me. Wisdom. If someone has wisdom, he or she has good judgment or understanding of what is right and wrong. Owls are often story characters who have great wisdom. Have you ever known someone who has shown great wisdom? What's the word we've been talking about? Wisdom. Let's see our learning targets. I can discuss elements of stories. I can identify characters, settings, and events in a fairy tale. I can understand the word wisdom. I can understand the phrase the land of Nod. I can write using the conjunction because to explain why Sleeping Beauty is a fairy tale. Land of Nod. When someone is in the land of Nod, it is a way of saying that they are sleeping. When your head dips down while falling asleep, it is called a nod. How long was the princess in Sleeping Beauty in the land of Nod? That's right, 100 years. Tell someone next to you what you think the most exciting thing she saw when she woke up was. When you are falling asleep at night, you can say that you are entering the land of Nod. Elements of a fairy tale chart. Together, let's fill in this elements of a fairy tale chart about Sleeping Beauty. The title of our story today is Sleeping Beauty. The setting of a story is the time and place a story takes place. Our story took place in the king's castle. Many fairy tales begin in a special way that gives us a clue about when the story takes place. The phrase once upon a time begins fairy tales. When a fairy tale starts with once upon a time, It means that it happened a long time ago. Fairy tales are often about princesses, princes, queens, or kings. People with these titles are called royalty. Although all characters in fictional stories like fairy tales are make-believe, most of the characters in Sleeping Beauty are based on real kinds of people. Some characters in fairy tales, such as the fairies in Sleeping Beauty, are magical characters who could not be real people. Fairy tales usually have one or more magical characters. In this story, the magical characters were fairies. Many fairy tales also have some things happen that are magic or fantasy. Magical events are one of the things that make fairy tales different from other kinds of stories. These are magical events that happened in Sleeping Beauty. The fairies' gifts to the young princess, the evil and good spells, and the sleeping enchantment. One problem that the royal family faces in Sleeping Beauty is the 13th fairy's evil spell. The solution for this problem is the 12th fairy spell to soften the curse, and the king ordered all the spindles should be burned. Another problem is the princess pricks her finger on a spinning wheel and falls asleep for 100 years. The solution was the prince kisses the princess and she wakes up. Characters in fairy tales almost always live happily ever after. We are now going to write a sentence about why Sleeping Beauty is a fairy tale. If you have a pencil and a piece of paper, take it out. If not, just follow along. Let's use the sentence starter. Sleeping Beauty is a fairy tale because. Think about several reasons why we could say Sleeping Beauty is a fairy tale. Go ahead, write your sentence. Sleeping Beauty is a fairy tale because. Make sure you use a capital letter and a punctuation mark at the end. My sentence is, Sleeping Beauty is a fairy tale because there are no fairies who cast spells. Let's review our learning targets. I can discuss elements of stories. I can identify characters, settings, and events in a fairy tale. I can understand the word wisdom. I can understand the phrase the land of Nod. I can write using the conjunction because to explain why Sleeping Beauty is a fairy tale. Happy learning!